Welcome to another edition of ArtScopeTO, the irregular, occasional arts podcast that differs from my regular film and film music related podcasts for my review site, KQEK.com. It's been a few months since the last edition, in part because I finished the grading of my short experimental documentary, BSV 1172, Your Friendly Neighborhood Video Store, for its Toronto and Canadian premiere at the iMyth Film Festival. I'll post thoughts on the screening and some excerpts from the audience Q&A at a later date, but for now let's move on to the latest podcast of ArtScopeTO, which features an artist whose work is showcased at Toronto's Urban Gallery. Whereas prior podcasts in this series were available in straight audio and alternate video versions with effects derived from oscilloscopes, time is a bit more pressing this fall, hence a simpler version that emphasizes voice, thoughts, and some closing comments on some of the topics discussed by the artist. In this case, Hamilton-based painter and photographer Hanna Kostanski, whose family immigrated from Poland to Canada. Kostanski grew up in Hamilton, studied and works in Toronto, but moved back to her hometown, which, like many surrounding cities, has been affected by the housing boom of downtown Toronto. Much has been written in the media outlets about prices, livability, and the government measures designed to cool markets. But the focus here is on history, something Kostanski understands from her interest in abandoned buildings in the two Canadian cities and Detroit, Michigan, perhaps the main city in the world that put ruined and abandoned urban structures and urban exploration on the map. For better or worse, there is a fascination with the weathered shells that struggle to retain integrity and dignity as natural elements and hungry metal scrappers pick apart structures until they're literally on the verge of collapse. Detroit's ongoing resurgence is gradual, with many once abandoned and shuttered structures built during its economic boom periods being restored and repurposed in dynamic urban renewal projects. In our interview, Kostanski also speaks of Hamilton's own boom, something that's been ongoing for many years now, including a thriving arts community and a quality of life that's been hammered away in downtown Toronto by rent hikes and the radical changing of former arts enclaves. Kostanski's work was profiled in BogTO and mentioned in Now magazine because her approach is very unique. After sourcing striking photos from the city archives, she translated the images into massive color canvases, painting friezes from a time in the city's growth that now seems almost quaint. The showstopper remains her portrait of Yonge and Dundas, based on a striking still by Harvey R. Naylor from 1978. My memories of that intersection began in the mid to late 1980s when I started collecting soundtracks, and would frequent that chunk of Yonge Street, which used to be packed with many music, stereo, and weird little shops long gone. It's a part of the city that's similarly been replaced by some good and bad architecture in a town known for developments that favor condos for the wealthy instead of businesses for the masses. We've become so accustomed to the glass pillars that line the expressways and continue to overtake unique neighborhoods that a collective memory of what existed and what should have been retained to a significant degree is fading. That's why Kostanski's paintings continue to fascinate. They promote discussion, trigger memories, and more importantly show us that our city does indeed have photographic proof of its architectural history and places of social interaction. From beaches to cinemas, shopping grids to transportation hubs, these are common areas that were and remain enmeshed in recurring tugs of war between owners, citizen groups, city councils, provincial boards, developers, and promises of revitalization. These battles are typical in cities whose boundaries are so comparatively new that each generation is accustomed to the changes in landscape, diminishing the value and comfort of still-standing edifices from the past. Those who felt the Yonge and Dundas of 1978 was garish may well prefer Dundas Square, but it'll be interesting to see how long that revitalized area staves off an overhaul because a new generation finds it ugly and bland in their eyes. Permanence is fleeting, and fidelity sometimes exists in the perverted use of facadism, making the wealth of city archives and the art it inspires so important.
So the project actually came sort of organically. I used to do a lot of paintings of abandoned buildings, especially when I was studying at OCAD. That was sort of my thesis, was about abandonment and the role of landscape and nostalgia and stuff like that. I was working from Hamilton buildings a lot and also taking some road trips down to Detroit. And then Hamilton kind of went through a revival, and there weren't as many abandoned buildings as there used to be, which is great. So I started looking in the Hamilton archives to start looking at the buildings as they used to be, or there was some urban development and some sprawl that was taking away some of the old buildings, and I wanted to see what they looked like. So I did a series of Hamilton-based paintings, and they were done on glass on windows. And then after I finished that collection, which was a really satisfying collection because Hamilton is where I live and where I was raised. So I started moving on to Toronto because it's another city that I love and a city that's so full of history. And I just sort of stumbled upon late one night, just surfing the net, going down some rabbit holes, looked at the Toronto Archive website, and their archive website is just unbelievable. It's such a great resource. So I just started drooling over the pictures basically and being really inspired to paint them. I just really wanted to capture what life in the city was like through different generations, especially within the 20th century, how things have changed and some things that have stayed the same.
How many photographs did you end up going through, and then how did you sort of sift it down to just a few?
That's the hard part. That's the hard part, because you want to do them all, and you want to do every one of them justice. So hundreds, easily hundreds. Once I whittled it down, it was sort of what I thought would be satisfying to paint for me, where I saw a lot of people in the photographs was also a key component of that. And I tried to go through just about every decade as representative of the 20th century. So once the idea for the actual collection started taking shape that it would be the 20th century, I tried to represent as many areas of the city, diverse areas and diverse time frames of the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm just curious, were there any particular photographs that you found unusually touching?
Once you start going down that rabbit hole, it's sort of difficult to stop. I found there were some of new immigrants coming to Toronto, and they were probably from 19-teens. I really found those very touching because I'm an immigrant myself, and it's just such a universally Canadian story to be able to see those early 20th century costumed people coming in, walking over a bridge to their new life, and that really touched me actually.
One of the things I'm sure you've noticed in Toronto is that there's just been so much rapid change over the last 20 years.
Yes.
How does that contrast, for example, with Hamilton, which is undergoing its own resurgence? Because obviously there are things that were lost in Toronto that were captured in the photographs, which you've also captured in the paintings as well, because it's sort of spreading out little by little.
Definitely. Hamilton is very much the same. It's just taken a slower route to get there. You would be shocked. I mean, I moved back to Hamilton from Toronto in 2008, and at that time I was doing a lot of photographs and a lot of paintings of the abandoned buildings, and now 9 years later those buildings have either been demolished or saved, which the ones that have been saved have been great, but Hamilton's becoming it's almost unrecognizable. You go downtown, and when I first moved back to Hamilton, I lived downtown, walking distance to everything. Here's one boarded up building and another one, and now all these buildings are condos, restaurants. It's really just gone into hyperdrive with how quickly things are turning over in Hamilton. Like, just even the restaurant scene in Hamilton right now is bonkers. Like, there's a new restaurant popping up every week, and they're all gourmet, delicious, wonderful, artisan, earth to table, amazing restaurants, which is not the way it was when I first moved back there. You'd have a couple of dim sum restaurants, and then every other building was a money mart or a cash advance loan, and those are starting to slowly go away, and downtown Hamilton has had quite a revival. And unfortunately, Hamilton, just like Toronto, hasn't always had the best interests of the historic buildings in mind, and they, a lot of them were demolished to turn it into parking lots, or some of them were saved, but a lot of them were destroyed. And in Toronto, not parking lots necessarily, but high-rise buildings and condos have taken the place of some historical buildings, and that does make me a little bit sad. And these paintings and the Hamilton collection before it are sort of paying homage to those lost, forgotten buildings, some of which have been repurposed beautifully, but for the most part they're gone.
There are certain generations that will definitely be affected by some of the photographs from the 1950s, the 1940s, and 1960s. And certainly for myself, like the Young and Dundas, which I still think is sort of like, I guess it's a major showpiece because it reveals so much of what was moving in and what was slowly disappearing. Because you can see a little bit of the Eaton Center, you can see the bank that got turned into the Gap, you have what used to be Rockwell Jeans and so on, and the fact that Young Dundas Square is now this thing. But it's how have people responded to you, and what have been some of the more, affecting comments about what you've managed to capture? Especially in color.
That one is, that one has actually been the one that has gotten the most attention for sure, because exactly as you say, people can put themselves into that intersection. That is somewhere that a lot of people, even if they weren't there exactly in 1978, I remember when the first time I came to Toronto in 1988, went down to Yonge and Dundas, and it was, the Eaton Center, and it was just the biggest thing I'd ever seen. But sort of the best comments that I've gotten is that people, and this actually happens quite often, is somebody saying, that could be me in there. I used to work there, or I used to take that route or that subway every day to get to work. So people are looking for themselves within the painting, which I think is really special, because I'm not a portrait painter. The thing that I do best at is buildings, so this was actually a pretty big departure for me to include people in these paintings, and I'm so glad that I did, because people can put themselves in that position. That one especially, because it's sort of an aerial view, you can zone in and almost, put a little pin in and say that could be me. And I wanted to make the people look as representational as possible. As I say, I'm not. My best work is not the people, is not the human form. But I think I tried to make people as characteristic of themselves as I could, and I think that way, without really having specific faces and in there, a lot of people can put themselves in that, saying, oh, this girl with the long hair and the bell-bottom pants, that's what I used to wear, and that's how I used to wear my hair, in the 70s, so that could be me, even though, the face is not really discernible, so you can have 3 people saying, oh, that's me.
And just out of curiosity, for the painting themselves, you chose a specific texture that you applied to it. What was the decision behind it, and how was it also easy to paint over, because it is a 3-dimensional texture?
It was not easy to paint over it. It was definitely, it would be a lot easier to do them flat, but there's a couple of reasons that the texture exists. The first one, the one that's always in the back of my mind, I've used texture a lot in my older paintings. If you were to see my old paintings of Detroit and Hamilton, the abandoned buildings, they're full of texture. And the reason for that is when I was in school, I had a teacher, I was doing really, I had this class called Photoshop for painters, which basically taught you how to use Photoshop as a sketch pad. And so I was sort of projecting the images I would make on Photoshop and projecting them onto a canvas and doing them flat. And one of my teachers said to me, well, why would you even bother to paint that? I mean, why couldn't you just print it out on a large scale printer? She's like, you have to justify your materials. You have to justify why you're doing a painting as opposed to a large scale digital print. What can a painting do that a digital print can't do? And so my thought was, texture is something that you can do on a painting that you can't do on a digital printout. And with the subject matter and the taken from old photographs, I wanted to show sort of a weathered, distorted, not perfect view of that photograph, because again, if it's fairly easy to get a black and white photograph colorized and then print it out large scale if you really wanted it. But this way, with the disruption, with the challenge of painting around the texture, it did make it, it made it a lot more tactile, and it was sort of an obvious choice to make it look like a degraded photograph, to make it look like a large scale, water damaged or slightly degraded photograph, but still, beautifully rendered, hopefully.
Yeah, you've, I guess, progressed from older derelict buildings in Toronto, Hamilton, and Detroit, and then you've moved to sort of pristine snapshots of the past. Is there any interest in capturing some of the new changes that have occurred, some of the newer buildings or developments? And do you have, even a rough idea of how you would treat that? Because the glass structures that sort of dominate Toronto, and I'm sure to some extent will dominate Hamilton, they are very much a mixed blessing.
Yes.
People react very specifically to them.
Yes, I feel the same way. I mean, their development is always important in the growth of a city. I wouldn't mind. The thing is, I'm always very interested in history, so if I could maybe somehow show the before and after of a location, or show the development in stages of that location. But I don't have much of an interest in painting those, large condos, large glass condos. They are, again, you could go and take a photograph of it and blow it up and print it out, and it would be probably better than any painting that I would do, and more true. They are glossy and they're pristine, as you say, whereas these old buildings, they're gone and you can see that sort of brick and mortar of them a lot more than you could a new development. And with that, the texture and the way that I tend to paint works more for historic buildings. And as a point of interest, I'm not nearly as interested in the big, glassy, sort of soulless buildings that are around. Even though, I'm sure there are people who would be interested in that, especially developers and people who would like to have a painting of that building, in their lobby or in their show center or whatever. But that's just not really me. That's not really unless I could show the progression throughout history, I'm just not super, super interested in it yet. Yeah. Until something exciting happens with it, and then maybe.
The City of Toronto Archives has a website where anyone can dive into collections donated by estates, photographic studios, and ordinary citizens who took pictures because it was their job, their cause, or their hobby. Online publications and their message boards are often filled with themed stills pulled from the archives and waves of posts from people compelled to share their memories of places and people who existed at one time. And it's no surprise people are drawn to Kostanski's work and the archives, which she credits and inadvertently encourages to be mined. But I'll close this podcast with 3 quick thoughts. So bear with me. My stomping ground has been the Bloor-and-Yonge area for many years, and certainly the last 16 have yielded major changes to that specific and nearby intersections. When a monster building on the southeast corner of Bay and Bloor was announced, that block of small restaurants, merchants, and coffee shops were given notice that the building and the small alley behind it were doomed. I used to stop into a small place called Coffee and chat with a lady that owned the tiny shop and sold beverages, sandwiches, and fruit. I'd frequently grab a banana or an apple, and purely for the excuse to say hello and chat a bit. This was part of a routine after popping out from the nearby subway entrance and headed for work. When the tenants had disappeared, the corner buildings were ripped out and the ground was flattened. And then nothing happened for years because the Lehman Brothers debacle supposedly killed what would have been something like an 80-plus story monster, all luxury condos. The corner remained empty and fenced off, but a massive light filled the intersection until a new developer took over and built a barely smaller monster with luxury condos, of which the top unit sold fast because agents paid people to camp out on the sidewalk for a week to save a place in the lineup to the sales office. What exists now in that corner is a sterile glass building where there's still no retail space. The area is still not finished. And whatever moves in won't be as diverse nor as democratic as the small businesses many used to stop in to eat and chat with friends, grab a coffee, maybe a burger, and soak in a bit of the sun as they walk down the small block. There's no independent merchant with which to converse because the building still hasn't reached its 100% completion, and the corner's dark footprint on the block will increase even further when another massive tower goes up just across the street on the southwest corner. With so much generic glass panel and thin metal strips rising up all around, it's impossible to even conceive of not only what existed, but the variety of people drawn to the area's former diversity. Now this is the second memory, which is a little bit shorter. On the same block close to where the condom shop stood, I think there used to be a shoe shop, and the last tenants realized the old brick building they'd settled into had a glass dome. So the paint was removed, and in the evening you'd see a glow in a turn-of-a-century retail shop that had a wooden frame, some color, and a modest yet regal glass cap long unseen. When the block's raising had begun, the little shop and its architectural history, you could call it commercial Toronto vernacular, was gone. What's sad is how the tenants took the time to do their own restoration and show the neighborhood a bit of history they never knew existed right there, sharing it for the short duration of their lease. I remember the dome and enjoyed glancing down the block and absorbing a small slice of that retail vernacular, but its existence may well have been missed by photographers and artists making what survives on film from other areas so important. And the third and final memory, which is much shorter. On the walls of his surgery and waiting rooms, my dentist at 94 Cumberland hung watercolor paintings of Yorkville. The pastel colors were soothing and the images often lacked people, just quiet corners, laneways, and fronts of homes. After a long period in stasis, the building's owner gave notice to the tenants, and the mostly medical businesses vacated by the end of February of 2015, after which the building that stood for at least 40 years was smacked down. No more coffee shops, a dress shop, or medical specialists whose original view of the hood was free of condos, hotels, and stacked homes. The glass pillars destined to thicken existing clusters throughout the city will one day inspire artists to make their own comments. But I wonder if their statements will encompass things political and make dry critiques of the banal. That's the apartment where the rent went up by 80%. That's the unit I sold because a 50-story building blocked the entire western view and a naked guy would never close the blinds. That's the amphitheater that was redeveloped and compacted to fit a thin blade of microcondos. And there's the parkway under which I walked a kilometer to find my local shoe repairman, cookbook shop, Greek restaurant, travel agent, hardware store, barber, fruit stand, and greasy spoon with a weekend Grand Slam special for under $15 including bottomless coffee cup. All packed into low-rise 1940s brick-studded blocks that used to be everywhere, and in what felt like lived-in neighborhoods instead of sterile blocks of hotels with a small bank outlet and generic coffee and drugstore chains making up the ground-level retail space that collectively offer little of note and leave no impression of nascent neighborhood culture and history. Visit HannaKostanski.com for more info on the artist and her fine work. Kostanski's paintings and prints are on exhibit and for sale until August 26 at the Urban Gallery at 400 Queen Street East. Visit urbangallery.ca for gallery times. Special thanks to Hanna Kostanski for her time, gallery manager Calvin Hambrook and curator Allen Shugar, and Glenda Fordham at Fordham P.R. for facilitating this interview. Prior editions of ArtScopeTO are available on iTunes, Google Play, Libsyn, and YouTube, and samples of my video art using vintage analog video gear are archived at vimeo.com/MarkRSan. Making of blogs and gear stills are also available at bigheadamusements.com.